Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. This is our third edition of Pure Live Experiences. If you've happened to be able to join us on our last ones, we really hope you've enjoyed them so far. And we're really excited to kick off today's webinar focusing on leadership with Simon Court. For those of you that don't know Simon, he's a global leadership consultant with over 20 years experience. He's the CEO and founder of Value Partnership and works as an advisor with senior leaders, boards, and executive teams on everything from building new leadership capabilities to new growth strategies and changing business models. We're really happy to have Simon join us today, and we hope you enjoy his presentation. Just before we get started, for any of you that are joining for the first time, we will be taking questions at the end of the presentation. So you can use the question and answer function on your screen and just type your questions in there throughout the presentation. And I will be going through those at the end. And also in this presentation today, we are going to be doing a couple of live poll questions. This is an opportunity for you to interact and have your say. So these will pop up on your screen when they come. And that's about it from me. I'm really looking forward to this session. I hope you enjoy it. And I will hand over to Simon. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Grania. Thanks very much. And welcome to everybody to the webinar, to my home here in Kent, in England. I just want to give a special welcome to anyone who was on Pure Pursuits in Colorado last year. It's kind of wonderful experience, sort of experience and friendship building moment that, you know, lasts a lifetime, and I guess we're all missing right now. Yet here we are coping with a crisis that could have been foreseen, but which has caught the world largely unprepared. I've spent the last 3 months coaching leaders from many different industries, in many different countries, and I can see how many countries are represented on this call, and they've all been affected to varying degrees by the crisis. And I guess I want to share some of that experience with you, some of the ways that they're responding and some of the ways we're trying to help them. I want to be positive. I'd like to be practical. And I should warn you, I'm going to talk a lot about other industries. I make no apology for that. I think it's actually very helpful to learn from what's going on in other corners of the business world, in other corners of the world, in fact. So I also want to say, I saw what Andy Lark covered in his previous webinar, if you were on that, and he covered a lot of ground around the strategic challenges of the crisis. So it's not my intention to go over that ground. I'm going to focus on the leadership agenda, and I'm going to particularly focus on the challenge of leading people through this crisis. So I have some slides, and I'm going to talk for maybe half an hour. I'll try and make it shorter if I can. And there's going to be plenty of opportunity for us to have a conversation at the end of it, with question and answers. And you don't have to ask me just about what I talk about. Feel free to ask me anything. So let's get the slides up and get going. So I'm going to argue that conviction is the bedrock of leadership, and it's especially important right now. And I think leadership is always important, right? If you're going to help navigate your company through good times or bad times. But right now, I want to focus on what this takes in the middle of a crisis. So in terms of our agenda, I'm going to try and explore with you what are the leadership demands you're facing right now. I'm going to talk about 5 different kinds of impact you should be looking for. What's your impact, and how do you recognize and measure impact in others? And I'm going to try and share some stories with you about how leaders are navigating their team through this crisis with plenty of conviction. It's a true test of your leadership, this period. And how are you leading your team through this crisis? How could you have more impact? How could you get the best out of your team at this point so that you can emerge, first of all, but secondly, maybe even emerge a bit stronger as a group? I'd like you to be able to look back on this period with some pride about the way in which your team got through it. And I think, there is a real choice here about whether you create a kind of isolated, rather defensive posture, or whether you can create a burst of team-driven innovation. I know there's a lot of things that are completely out with your control at the moment, but this isn't. This is a real choice, and you have real options for how you lead right now. Because, as you know, the world is temporarily closed. I'm not, well, not quite close, but more or less. There's all sorts of dire predictions out there about just how bad the forthcoming recession is going to be. Because as Andy said, the crisis is not the crisis, it's the recession that follows. I don't know, frankly, whether it's going to be a V-shaped, a W-shaped, a U-shaped, or an L-shaped recession. I'm not even going to go there, but it is going to be a recession. And I can tell you the latest prediction from Bain is that it's going to last at least 3 quarters, and are advising all their clients to act on that basis. So we know, right, many businesses will not survive. Their cash will run out before the revenue starts to flow again. And I know that some of you are probably worrying about the risk of a second wave. Just when your cash defenses and your energy levels are as low as they could be, facing a second wave feels like something you desperately want to avoid, right? But all you can do is the best that you can, and to be kind to yourself as you go through this crisis. So there's lots of interest in how national leaders are handling the crisis, and justified respect for how some people seem to be doing a particularly good job. Most of them women, I should add. Trust is a very precious commodity right now, whether you're managing a travel business or you're trying to manage a country. If you follow British politics, just ask Boris Johnson about trust, because he certainly lost mine. I won't say any more about that. I risk getting into politics. But as in any crisis, your field of perception narrows. Business leaders like you are kind of eyeball to eyeball with rapidly changing demands on you. How are you going to pay staff? How are you going to access government support? And while we're at it, how on earth are you going to homeschool your kids? It's not just getting through the next week. At times it feels like getting through the next few hours. A crisis is like that. It sort of sucks you in and dominates bandwidth. The psychology of this is interesting to me as well. Some of the leaders I'm coaching are classic leaders who love winning. Certain types of personality always feel more comfortable and make better decisions when the environment is benign, when their self-image is pristine, when people are smiling. Today, the environment favors those who can support the morale of anxious colleagues, those who value teamwork. And somehow, you've got to try and sustain both a holistic view of what's really going on in the world and with your business, while handling those minute-by-minute demands. We also know that the world is going to be changed by this, right? I know in Italy, a country I know rather well and love very much, that e-commerce has advanced massively in the last few months, something like 80%, for good reasons, obviously. But the crisis has brought forward change that people thought would take 5 years and done it in 3 months. One of our clients, Depop, the British fashion site, is getting 200% increases in web traffic daily right now. So going back to this idea of a dual leadership focus, you've got to try and think about what the world's going to look like on the other side. And the crisis has offered some clues about a future that's coming at us at great speed. I mean, with more home working, new travel patterns, which are going to be hugely important to you as a community, virtual, mixed reality, and more. So your ability to take a cool and rational look at that future whilst trying to ride out the storm is going to be very important. So somehow you've got to be Superman or Superwoman, simultaneously a creative strategist while having a very, very strong action orientation. I'll remember that comment because we're going to come back to some of those qualities a bit later. The crisis sort of exposes your business. It sort of tells the story of what's really going on. I mean, if you're if you were without financial reserves and struggling with liquidity, for some businesses, this is the end. And you can see that with certain businesses like airlines and some of the tour operators. It's also exposing the state of your business model and how well adapted it is for the digital world for many of our clients. My friend and client at Depop said, COVID-19 will prove that businesses who aggressively digitally transformed now have the best chances of survival. And he put it, digital is going to be business's vaccine. Very interesting statement. Your customer relationships, I mean, are your customers canceling or are they postponing? How much loyalty have you carried into this crisis? You will be finding out now. Loyalty, as you know, takes time to build and no time at all to destroy. And then there's your team and your culture. I mean, are your people engaged and ready to adapt? Now that you need that goodwill, is it there for you? You can't just build it overnight. And as you go through this crisis, for those people you can afford to keep, you're going to learn a lot about them. Who really steps up and who disappoints? Make notes. This is important with the future in mind. And then last but not least, there's you. Are you stepping up or are you stepping back? Are you capable of putting the safety and the kind of transparency that your team needs right now ahead of your own needs and anxieties? Because that's what leadership demands, right? So there's nothing easy and there's nothing obvious about how you navigate this environment, and I'm not going to pretend otherwise. Just to give you a couple of examples of what some of our clients are trying to do, I think what they illustrate is it's really important not to overcomplicate either your message or the action that you wish to take. So a ride-hailing business that we're dealing with in Karachi, I'm coaching the CEO, he's using this narrow window of lockdown to get his team to go on an agile sprint using agile methodology to really strengthen his team and their levels of accountability. And he made me laugh last week when he said, I almost don't want the lockdown to end, Simon, because we're making so much progress and we're learning so much as a team. We have a client in Frankfurt who's in the workwear business, an online business, and they were running out of cash fast until one of their clients said, can you get masks made for us? And they talked to their suppliers in China, gave them the specifications, and now they are bringing PPE into Germany and into other parts of the world at a much faster rate than they were ever operating. So this business that was running out of cash and was only turning over £2 million, euros, is now going to turn over somewhere between 40 and 50 million euros by the end of this year. So this crisis has done them no harm, and they're building clients for the future. One of our German clients based in Malta had very strong liquidity. And although the sports market was shut down, that's the market they serve, they have kept everybody very focused on delivery and learning how to operate virtually. One other example, our Austrian InsurTech business are using this period to redesign their business model completely and deal with all of their tech debt. So the thing they all have in common is energizing their team, focusing everybody's efforts, and making sure everybody's morale stays as elevated as you can possibly achieve. I kind of like this quote from Charlie Munger, who's Warren Buffett's partner in Berkshire Hathaway. He said, our job is to find a few intelligent things to do, not to keep up with every damn thing in the world. So although it's very tempting for you to be constantly trying to keep up with all the latest and breaking news on this, find a few intelligent things to do with your team and keep them focused on doing things that will really move your business forward when an opportunity to start earning revenue comes again. This slide has a kind of set of general lessons that I and my clients have been learning, I think, over the last few months. And I'll spend a minute or two extra here because this is really important, I think. These apply, I think, to any business. I mean, firstly, in the middle of a crisis, especially, buy yourself some time. Don't get rushed into making fast decisions if you can help it. And although you might need to act quickly to preserve cash, try and take a breath and go out on the balcony and get some perspective on some issues, many issues, in fact. It'll be better to involve more people, not less, and to think things through with both that short-term and a longer-term consideration. Secondly, protection. Protect what you have, obviously the safety of those around you, but also the people you want to retain, your most precious customers, your values, your reputation, your cash. You only run out of cash once, obviously. Look at the extreme scenario and have a plan. Be ready, but act to preserve what you have, the most precious resources you have. Thirdly, create a safe space. I'm not talking about virus safe now. I'm talking about psychologically safe. A culture in which people feel safe to share their concerns, to be vulnerable, to ask for help. I mean, as a leader, you need to be authentic and trusted. And this is an emotional time for everybody, including you. So remember to be human first and foremost before you try and be a great strategist or a great implementer. Fourthly, work as a group, set goals as a group. What are the 3 to 5 most important ones? No more. Early in the crisis, they were probably things like safety, cash flow, customer relationship management, operational continuity. But moving into a different phase, and these defensive strategies need to be supplemented by looking at new potential offerings or opening up new markets or trying to secure new business. Whatever drove results yesterday may be irrelevant today. So it's your job to adapt quickly. And as a leadership team, try and track your progress on these priorities. Try and learn and adjust frequently. Don't just decide what to do, try and decide what not to do. That's what strategy means. Fifthly, hold to your purpose and values. If you are purpose-led as a leader, and I know many of you are in this industry, you'll find a way to fulfill your purpose in the new world. So don't lose sight of it. So how are you going to work in what will emerge as a very different world? And if your values are your true values, now they will guide you. Ours, generous, clear-sighted, true partner, are informing everything we do right now. And if we're not sure what to do, we turn to them for guidance. Sixth, stay connected to your stakeholders. Your team, first and foremost, things like daily pulse checks, regular team check-ins, your clients. Be mindful about how this is affecting them and their sense of security. What can you do to support them, even if it doesn't immediately pay the bills? Your business partners, take care of them as best you can. I mean, be honest, be empathetic, be kind. We're not living in the 1980s. Let's try and be good human beings first and foremost, as well as good leaders. And last but not least, in terms of my kind of general things to do, bold thinking. Hope isn't a good business strategy. Look at what's really going on around you, markets, segments. Try and understand how customers' expectations are changing. Try and accelerate things like automation wherever you can and strengthen resilience. We all need to learn to become more agile permanently. This isn't going away, folks. We're not going to return to a nice, stable world, I sincerely doubt. So kind of zeroing in on leading your people, I did promise to spend more time on this. Just to say it starts with ourselves, right? If we don't sort of get clear about how we want to lead, and start putting that into practice, there will be no followers. I've come to realize in my role as a coach that we all have self-limiting beliefs, actually. And even those leaders you look up to and admire and think of as kind of heroes, when you dig a little bit, you find that they all have self-doubts. They all suffer from pessimism at times. They all sometimes feel we're not good enough, or not as good as others, or that we lack luck, or whatever it is. And all of those things help us to, we start to second guess our own decisions and lack real conviction. So it's not that you shouldn't listen to those voices, but we need to quieten them a bit and focus on our strengths and have a clear narrative and be clear how we're helping our team to perform. Don't let those voices hold you back. So I'm a bit of a fan of Ray Dalio's book, Principles. And if you haven't read it, I definitely would recommend it. I mean, he's interesting because he's a hedge fund leader, right? He's a financial guy. And he kind of learned the importance of understanding how people are wired, as he calls it. And because of the different ways our brains are wired, we all experience reality in different ways. And so we all have a bit of a distorted view, actually. None of us are right. And this is something we need to get to grips with. And if we want to know what's true and what to do about it, you need to understand your own brain. And you need to understand how your team are wired as well, if we want to maximize their impact and their contribution. And we all want a team that feels potent, right? But first, you have to get your own act together. So here's where we are going to do our first poll. It's your chance to contribute to the debate here. So my question for you is, do you really understand your strongest impact as a leader? And you've got 5 options there, and the poll will come up on the screen any second now. There it is. So are you 100% clear? Are you pretty clear? You think you are anyway. Are you unsure? Are you not at all clear? And have you never even thought about the question? That's the A option, or A. So please vote now. We won't be leaving it up there for too long, otherwise people will get bored. So obviously this is confidential in a sense, so do feel free to be completely brutally honest. There's no right answer to this question. So I think in about 5 seconds, Jess, if you don't mind, let's have a look at the sort of provisional results. Okay, so 11 of you are 100% clear. Congratulations to you lot. One thing I'd ask you to think about is maybe just check that with people around you. It's often surprising what people say about our strengths when you check in with others. I think the truth is all of us have sort of relatively patchy self-insight. It's very easy to delude ourselves. Pretty well, that's a pretty decent answer. I like the doubt that you've got because I'm full of it, and I think it's worth checking that out. In a minute, I'm going to share with you a tool that you can use to get sharper clarity. And a quarter of you roughly are unsure. Okay, well, I'm going to go on with the presentation, so we'll close that for now and give you a kind of frame of reference for thinking about what that impact might be, so that it might help you to develop your view. And just to say, I used this on Pure Pursuits in Colorado with everybody and gave everybody feedback on it on the trails there. And when we can finally go to the Dolomites, I'm planning on being one of the mentors on that trip, if we can ever make it. I'd like to bring that with us. So if you're coming on that trip, you're going to get that feedback on that trip. So what I'm talking about is the GC index, otherwise known as the Game Changer Index. And it's a helpful contribution to your ability to make better people decisions. And you know, when you're managing a team or leading a team, and you're either not sure of your own impact or the impact that people in the team have, this is a great way of finding out a bit more about it. I mean, companies already use sort of information about people's expertise, their experience on their CV, and their personality, are they introverted or extroverted? But this tool is unique in that it focuses on impact, and your impact is highly visible and makes a big difference to the kinds of results you can achieve, and also makes a big difference to the dynamic of the team. So let's have a look at what the GC Index is. So it is a tool. You respond to roughly 50 something questions, and it gives you feedback through the lens of this framework. And it was originally designed to find out what are the ingredients of game-changing people, and pivoted to become a tool to find out about the ingredients of game-changing teams. And the research shows that when you're looking at game-changing impact, two things really drove it. One was creativity or imagination, your capacity for original thinking, and the other was your drive to turn ideas into reality, which they called obsession. So there are 5 possible profiles that result from this, which they call proclivities, a positive inclination to behave in a certain way. There are the strategists and the game changers at the top. The strategist being the pragmatic, that is focused on mapping the future. The game changer being the obsessive, the one who wants to transform the future, the one who's always focusing on a new idea or innovation. And then at the bottom, we have those who are focused on the tangible pursuit of particular outcomes or excellence. These are the implementers, the pragmatists, and the polishers who want to really refine a product or a process and learn from experience. And in the middle, we have the playmaker, who is driven by collaborative endeavor and collective contribution. So all of these roles rub along more or less in a team, and you start to think about your team and what you have in your team. The strategists tend to view the implementers as being a bit down in the weeds. The implementers think of the strategists as having their heads in the clouds. The game changers are really rather focused obsessively on their own idea, and it might be a great idea, but they're annoying the rest of the team because they won't stop going on about it. Whilst the polisher thinks nobody's got high standards, and the playmaker's scratching their head wondering how on earth they found themselves in the same room with this bunch of people. So it's really quite useful to understand the mix and nature of the contributions you have in your team, and to try and get the best out of those contributions. Because when you bring them together, they can be enormously powerful. That's one of the things I really like about this tool. You know, every team needs this capacity to create original ideas, make sense of them, make them happen, make them brilliant, and work together to achieve that end rather than fall out over it. So I'm going to do another poll here. I'm sort of curious to know which you think is closest to you. And so in a minute, yeah, there it is. You're going to have a chance to respond to this. And just to help guide you through this, a strategist is somebody who's really good at seeing the future and engaging others with a really clear sense of direction about that future. The game changers are those individuals who really come up with the ideas and new possibilities and transformational ideas. And then we have the playmakers, who are really focused on getting the best out of their colleagues individually and collectively. The implementers, who are sharply focused on getting things done, such, you know, who and when and how fast. All of those questions are really on the tip of the tongue of an implementer. And lastly, the polisher, they focus very much on continuous improvement in the pursuit of excellence. So I'd like you to vote for which of those maybe best describes you. I can't see whether you're voting. I'm seriously hoping you're voting now. Again, this is not very scientific, of course. Normally people complete the instrument to get feedback on these. And I should say that if you're struggling to make a choice, that's okay, because actually when you get a profile back on this test, usually, not always, but usually you find that you have 2 core strengths. Some even find they have 3. So let's have a look at the results, please, Jess. I'm really curious to see the makeup of this group and how varied it is. Oh, look at that. I'm really quite happy to see that. We've got a very even distribution of proclivities across the team, and it just means that if we could all work together across the world, we might be quite effective if we could overcome the challenge of working virtually. See, one of the things about this is if you're aware of your strengths and the way in which you operate best, you have the power to choose people around you who complement those strengths rather than simply duplicate them. And I think that's one of the things that great leaders do. They surround themselves with people who are better at the things they're not particularly good at. Okay, thanks for that, Jess. We can remove that now. So how does this help? Well, one thing I wanted to say is I was dealing with a leadership team of this ride-hailing business I mentioned earlier, and the CFO turned out to be a playmaker, whilst the CEO was a very strong game changer. And the CFO looked at this and he said, now I realize what kind of leader I really am. And I was confused about it because of the way I focus on relationships. Now I realize I have a very important contribution to play. And he did, because he was helping this CEO who was a game changer, who was constantly introducing new ideas into the business, to slow down his rate of innovation, to give the business time to focus on execution so that they could really scale the business effectively and efficiently. I also had one person in my team who, when they looked at their profile, was quite tearful about it. And I said, "What? Why are you tearful about it?" And it turned out, I mean, she came out as a polisher, and she was finding that when proposals were going out to clients, they had been altered since she last saw them. And she was a bit distressed by the fact that it didn't have the quality that she had put into it when it left her desk. So the best thing to do with something like that is to put her at the end of the process so that she has the final word on quality. Earlier, I talked about the fact that we have voices in our head, and those voices can be helpful and sometimes less helpful. Well, this might help you to connect with that a bit further. So I'll give you an example. Take the strategist at the top. I have no doubt, by the way, you're probably following your own line in this, having picked which of these profiles best represents you. If you take the strategist and you think about where you are in the crisis, your existing strategy has been completely upended, unceremoniously. You probably feel disoriented. So your mission is to start collaborating with others to build a new plan that sort of does reflect the latest and best assessments of the new world, right? So you've got to try and develop a more agile approach that's more resilient to changes in context than the one that you had. And that will give you a sense of clarity about what needs to be done. But you're going to have to be agile, as all of us will. So it's just an example of how thinking about tapping into your strengths can be carried over into looking at your team. And if you understand their best contribution, you can help them through this crisis as well. So what that looks like is, getting to understand them a little bit more deeply than you do at the moment, perhaps with or without a tool like the GC index. If you've got literally no cash and it's impractical for you to do this for some reason right now, think about other ways you can really get to know them better. Try and understand what's their best impact. and what are the self-limiting beliefs that they have? You know, what's causing them stress? What would unlock their energy and productivity? And try and help every member of your team to perform, so you have a really high-performing team coming out of this crisis. One of the things I think, looking back at all the teams I'm working with, is that many of them are actually getting stronger during the crisis, even though their business is under a lot of financial stress. And I can tell you there's one business that I hope he's on the call, but Zora and his team at Paradox Hospitality, thanks to Zoran's vision, they have adopted the GC index for their Maslina resort project. So I think they used it in hiring. And also he's used it to help strengthen teamwork in his immediate team. So I mentioned Pure Pursuits in Colorado. We carried out the GC index on everybody coming on that pursuit. And I shared this picture with the team during the Pure Pursuit when we were at the Little Nowling Aspen. And this is just a set of individual debriefs from A through O for all of the people who were on the Pure Pursuit. So you can see we had a full range of profiles. There were 7 game changers, which perhaps isn't surprising in that there's a lot of very driven, quite creative business founders on the program. So, you know, look at, for example, profile A, very strong right-hand side profile with lots of obsession. Same for profile G, very dominant, game-changing proclivity, relentless energy and focus around new ideas and innovation. Also had 4 implementers on this group. So look at, for example, profile I, a 10 out of 10. Any score above 7 is a high score. So this is a very delivery focused, very pragmatic leader with quite a strong sense of purpose. Look at that strategy score just behind it, an 8. So this isn't somebody who just wants to be a headless chicken. This is somebody who wants to really execute in line with purpose. We also had 3 playmakers, for example, profile O, where the dominant kind of approach is to bring the team together and get the best out of the different contributions in the team. And that's the team profile. You can see there, there's sort of combination of overarching strength around game changer and implementer. So this is a team that typically would be very entrepreneurial, very good at coming up with ideas and executing them quickly, but wouldn't necessarily be that great at scaling a business because it's not so strategic and doesn't continuously learn from experience and continuously improve. So it's very interesting the sorts of insights this can generate. So I'm going to wrap up now. I mean, question for you is what you're going to ask me questions, but my question for you is what's your leadership response? And whatever it is, you've got to focus on trying to get your team aligned and performing with impact. And that means, you know, forging a view as a group and backing yourself and having the courage to back yourself through this and not lose sight of that vision and focus. And I'll finish with this idea, the Stockdale Paradox, which was included in Jim Collins' book called Good to Great. And he interviewed a guy called Admiral Stockdale, who was the most senior ranking American military officer who was imprisoned in Hanoi. And it was known as the Hanoi Hilton. It wasn't a good place to be. He was tortured continuously during that 8-year period. And Jim Collins asked him, you know, how did you survive that experience? And he said, I retained faith all the way through that somehow I will prevail, regardless of the difficulties. And then he was asked the question, who didn't make it out? And he said, oh, that was easy. That was the optimists. The optimists were always thinking, I'll be out by Christmas. And Christmas came and went, and they were still in prison. And they kind of died of disappointment. So his other gift to us to think about is you've got to confront the most brutal facts of your current reality, whatever they might be, but never lose that faith that you'll find a way through in the end. So question for you is how can you and your team embrace that paradox? Because That's not going to be easy, right? Okay, I think that's enough of listening to me. I'd like to get some of your questions, so I'll stop sharing now.
Simon, thank you so much for that. It's actually really interesting because I think it's very relevant for the current, crisis situation we're facing at the moment. But in terms of leadership throughout your company on a day-to-day basis, it's also incredibly relevant. And I mean, I was listening to that, thinking about what we're doing in our teams and how we're handling it. And I think especially when we're working remotely, there are a lot of challenges with that. So I'll probably kick off with one question myself. And then if everyone has got questions, please put them through the Q&A bubble and I'll read them out. But probably touching on the remote working, how do you think leaders should be handling, keeping their teams together and making sure that the momentum isn't lost, and respect and drive and ideas and all of that from working so distorted and separate?
Yeah, that's a universal challenge right now, of course, and I don't think the experience of businesses in different sectors makes any difference, really. I mean, the first thing is for yourself not to become isolated. It's very easy to become sort of rather insular and to look at the four walls of your office or your living room or whatever it is at home, and to lose sight of the fact that you've got a team that's spread out across different homes around the country or around the world. So you've got to stay connected with them, I think. And in doing that, there's informal ways of doing it, such as having a virtual coffee, just sending somebody a message and saying, can I just check in with you? Just to chat and have no agenda and just to listen and show some empathy. But also you can be more kind of targeted and focused than that. I mean, you can have weekly, even daily check-ins as a group. And I think you've got to get used to getting to grips with the technology. So learn how to get the best out of Zoom, learn to use virtual collaboration tools like Miro boards, which are like virtual whiteboards. So even when you're not together in the same room, you can actually be creative and still have your whiteboard and still put your post-it notes up on the wall. So there are plenty of things you can do, but underneath this, I would stress, just understand the different people you've got in your team and think about what do they really need from you right now, and how can you meet those needs despite the fact that you're working virtually.
Yeah. And then I think another question that has come up is, and a lot of purists themselves were quite small companies or independently owned, and not massively, huge number of employees. Is it, realistic to have a good mixture of the 5 elements within the GC index in your team?
Yeah, well, it's probably not going to be realistic to have, I mean, you'd be either very skillful at recruiting and building your team, or very lucky to have all 5 perfectly represented in a group. I think what's interesting is that I mentioned on the call that in reality, most of us have at least 2 strengths, a sort of principal strength and a backup strength. And it's perfectly possible for people to draw on their backup strengths. It just costs you more energy. So if you ask me to be a playmaker, I can do it with sort of relatively effortlessly. But if you ask me to be a great strategist, I really have to work at it. And I think it's okay to say to people, just show up the best you can be and encourage them to experiment in other parts of their makeup, and to have some confidence to try and do that. If you can do that, why not them?
Yeah. There's a question here from Timothy Teo, and he says, how do we lead authentically and with sensitivity, having had to make many tough decisions at the start of the retrench, and some have been furloughed, others have been sent into semi-hibernation. When we come out of it, what tone do we need to lead with, given the hard choices that have been made?
Yeah, and just to be clear, I don't know whether he means what tone do I adopt with the people who are left. I assume that's what the question means. So this is one of the biggest and toughest challenges, I think, for leaders right now. That on one hand, people like me are saying show a lot of humanity and a lot of empathy, and at the same time you're having to make some brutally tough decisions. So I think you've got to first of all think what's the right thing to do for the business, because you're not just protecting its financial future and its purpose, you're also protecting those members of the team that you can hang on to and afford to keep. So there is this sense of greater good about what you're trying to do. And when it comes to how you deal with the people in front of you who you have to effectively say goodbye to after many years of service, perhaps, I think you can do that with transparency. You can do that with generosity. You can do that. There are great ways of saying goodbye to people and letting go to people that show your humanity. And when you finally get back together and your team is a bit smaller, and there are kind of missing chairs or missing people and empty chairs, I think at that point you should talk about it as a group. I'm not talking about group therapy. I'm just talking about, how do people feel about this? This has been very tough. And don't try and do this thing that leaders sometimes do and say, it's been so hard on me. I've really gone through a miserable time having to say goodbye to all these people. Focus on the people who have lost their jobs. Focus on the concerns you have for others in the team. Don't feel sorry for yourself. Focus on others. It'll earn respect, and it'll show up as kind of classy leadership, really. So focus on others and use all the empathy you can muster.
Yeah, definitely. I think it's about having that human and open interaction, isn't it? And there isn't a rule book to what's happening at the moment, and you just have to show that trust, which is what you were talking about before, being such a valuable thing, having trust. So I couldn't agree more with you on that. A couple more questions that are coming in. So Emily Shulman has said that she has noticed both in herself and in the members of her team that the ability to maintain focus is particularly difficult right now, especially now that many of the normal urgencies and busy energy are absent or lowered. Is there any advice that you have for sort of keeping the team focused?
Yes, I think I'd go back to what I talked about with my team in Karachi, who they kind of like, the business stopped. Literally nobody's ride hailing. There's nothing. And the CEO said, what do we, what the hell do we do? And we kind of identified, in his case, 5 or 6 goals that the team could really focus on and deliver on over the next 6 weeks. And so we ran a 6-week sprint, and every week there would be a goal setting process. They'd look at the measures from the previous week. They'd advance their plans to the next kind of stage, and they'd review progress, and he would check in with people on a regular basis. So I think try and develop a positive agenda of meaningful work that will make your business stronger for when this crisis comes to an end. Because as I said, I think you can make your business stronger coming out of this crisis, and learn how to operate with greater accountability, with more focus, and a stronger team dynamic.
Yeah. And I think we've got time for just one more question, which is actually from Zoran, and he's saying, and if anyone's got other questions, do feel free to email them over. We'll make sure we try and get them answered. I'm just a bit conscious of time. But Zoran's question is, how important is it to recognize that majority of the people are very unprepared for a global crisis like this after decades of growth, especially in the West? And that while the fall has been extremely global, the rise back up will be very individual? It's a good question.
Yeah, it's a hell of a question. I'm going to take it up with him when I next talk to him. Just give me the first part of the question again, because I got distracted by the second part.
So sort of how important is it to recognize that a lot of the people were unprepared for a crisis like this, especially in the West when we've been kind of going through growth?
Yeah.
And while the fall is going to be very global, the rise back, how's that going to be more individual?
Yeah, okay. Well, I think the first part, I'm not really sure the answer to the second part, except to be really smart and quite tactical about where the opportunities are and how you help pivot the business to take advantage of those marketing opportunities. But the first part is really about the, you know, the kind of curve of grief and shock that people go through when they experience a crisis, whether it's in their personal lives or whether it's in their business lives. And I know Andy briefly showed a slide of what that that curve looks like. From a business point of view, I don't know how valid it is, but from an individual point of view, I think it's extremely valid that people go through a phase of shock, and it can be followed by depression. And then when you're working from home and feeling isolated, it becomes worsened in a way because you aren't talking to people about it. And I've got team members in my own business who are on furlough, and they've shared with me just how difficult it is at times, despite the fact that the government is funding 80% of their salary, and for the time being they feel more secure in their jobs. That shock continues actually because they aren't engaged on a day-to-day basis with their work. So I think it's important to do all the things I talked about earlier about virtual working, to stay really connected with people, help them to talk about it, recognize that some people are coping with this better than others, not to make them feel bad about it, find ways of strengthening their resilience, and even talking about resilience or doing training and learning during this period. This is a great time for doing some new learning. And that can be helping the team to learn to operate in a new way. And it can also mean, specifically adopting kind of virtual learning modules, doing things like the GC Index and learning more about yourself, just finding ways of turning this period of relative calm in the face of this crisis into an opportunity for personal growth.
Yeah. And I know I said last question, but I just thought I'd try and squeeze one more in. But off the back of talking about the GC Index, is there a trend, or have you ever seen that if someone has a stronger type of personality or style, it changes when they're under stress, or does it always remain the same?
I think the underlying sort of psychology sort of remains pretty constant. I think the environment changing quickly will clearly demand different things, and you'll learn different things about the people around you. I think it's something I sort of hinted at in my presentation. So, certain aspects of our makeup, our underlying personality, they're not going to change. Our behavioral responses will change. That's why we're able to learn new things. So I think, maybe that's one way of thinking about this period. It's a period of personal growth, learning about yourself, learning about your team, learning about resilience, learning to be more agile, to expect a bit less certainty about the world than we've all grown up with. I mean, it goes back to Zoran's question. We've been, sailing through decades of relative prosperity and growth. And now we're faced with a much more kind of terrifying world where our governance doesn't feel very effective.
Yeah.
And the world feels a bit more dangerous. And I think that's far more than about business, right? And I think a glass of wine with Zoran is the only way of really answering that question properly.
Or two. Well, Simon, honestly, thank you so much. I really hope that everyone that's been listening has found it insightful. I definitely have. We've recorded it. We will be sending you some more questions that we've just not had time to get through. So if you don't mind, I'll pop those over to you. If anyone else wants to reach out to Simon, please let us know. We'd happily share his email with you. And we'll be sending out a recording and a written summary of today's session, so you can have access to that in the coming days. And stay tuned for other Pure Live experiences that we will be sharing with you down the line. So again, massive thank you, Simon. Thank you so much. And
You're most welcome.
rest of the day.
Thank you.
Okay, bye.